Behold, the power of discharge. It's obviously very good in Elite Sanctuary Onslaught, where there are enemies everywhere. It's also very good for defending things. It stops attackers, and with Capacitance, it gives the defense target a lot of shield restoration at the same time. And you read that title correctly. A Volt build that's focused on discharge and Capacitance can also do a lot for the Void Rig Necramech. That's right. And I'm not only talking about shooting the Archabex through electric shields, but that is a thing that you can do. I'm going to show you these builds and then move on to some gameplay and discussion before finishing up with the fashion. Capacitance takes care of your survivability very elegantly. Overshields are great because you can store 1200 of them without a health or shield mod. The main payoff for using Capacitance Volt in normal gameplay is that you get respectable damage and crowd control from discharge, as well as the ability to restore lots of overshields at the same time. There are other ways to kill enemies with abilities, and other ways to basically heal objectives and or yourself, but this ability with this augment does both. This build is going to be all about discharge, but discharge's damage is affected by strength and range and duration. Range is especially good on abilities with a radius, because increasing that radius increases the total area affected by more with every additional point you get, because circles. The range gets better the more of it you have here, unless you cover the entire map. And for discharge, range will determine the chaining range, that is, the range in which enemies will zap each other, which is the main force multiplier that allows discharge to do significant damage. Duration is also excellent because it makes Capacitance more useful in situations where it otherwise wouldn't be. If enemies are going to die anyway, quickly with strength or more slowly with duration, and you don't particularly need them to die really quickly, duration is better because it'll result in you getting overshields for longer. For those reasons, I think both narrow-minded and overextended are also good choices here. It's a bit of a shame to have to trade off something when all three of these stats are multipliers. It's not really nice to have a mod that gives you range but not strength, because they both make the ability do more damage, but I do think that range and duration have distinct advantages that strength doesn't. But I also wanted to mention that an even mix of basic strength, duration, and range mods is also very powerful. You might as well use Streamline too. You can use the non-primed and umbral versions of Continuity and Intensify. This is a pretty good build to go for on a new account because the basic ability stat mods alone can get you off the ground. That is kind of what this build wants. I'm just deciding that I would rather prioritize range and duration over strength, but making them all pretty even is really good. This is a great build for just all the positive stat mods. Corrosive Projection will help discharge get through armored enemies, so that's a good choice for an aura either way. I also recommend Arcane Resistance. Capacitance can save you a lot of mod space by handling survivability mostly by itself, but Toxin goes through shields, and many sources of Toxin damage are Toxin status effects. This makes you immune to those. Now I'll plop Capacitance on there. I know it seems strange to have low strength when discharge is going to do damage, but I'm going to focus on duration and range and just leave my strength very low for now. There's something else very important that this loadout needs, and that's energy. Like a whole lot of energy. You want to be using discharge as often as possible, and it's 100 energy. If you have Arcane Energize, now is the time. Pull it out. Even if it's a low-ranked copy, it's still going to help a ton. Then I'm going to add Dispensary. I'm replacing Speed because my strength is so low that it's pretty much useless in this case. If you build for a more even mix of stats, like I mentioned before, I'd get rid of Shock instead of Speed. Really, it's pretty close anyway. You can get rid of either. Why Dispensary in particular? Well, my high duration ensures that Dispensary pays for itself, but if it were just that, then Spellbind with Spellbound Harvest would also be a good way to restore energy. That ability is looking for range, which is also already on this build. Spellbound Harvest is a pretty good energy restoring option here, but I think Dispensary has a lot of advantages in this case. For one thing, energy conversion provides a reliable source of strength for discharge that doesn't come at the cost of duration. This is really easy to set up because you'll constantly get energy orbs from Dispensary. You can tell by now that I really like duration with Capacitance. I'm going a little out of my way to avoid losing it, and one reason why is that it makes discharge more useful when you aren't hitting a ton of enemies at once. You can have a few enemies serve as shield batteries for you, go fight other enemies with that powerful defense online. And for example, in Steel Path missions, discharge just can't kill armored enemies with that much health, so having duration means it's still very useful as a stun that goes through walls and generates a ton of overshields. For the remaining slot in the build, you could add more strength, probably Umbral Intensify, or you could include adaptation to make those overshields tankier. I like that for the shield battery solution I mentioned before. Adaptation is also really powerful if you are regenerating whatever's taking damage, because it's not making you much more tanky until you take a lot of hits. So if you're constantly restoring whatever is taking the damage, adaptation can be pretty powerful. I really like that. I like that battery shield situation I mentioned before, so I'm going to use this. But for that little intro segment, I had Natural Talent equipped, and you saw how that made Discharge's cast animation really fast. So if you like that, you don't want to go through that animation constantly, you will be seeing it pretty often. Natural Talent is a good choice too. You could also go for the Equilibrium combo with Dispensary in that last slot, but I'm not going to do that here. One thing that happens when you're just popping off with Discharge constantly is that you have a fair amount of downtime, so the main thing that this Volt build gives to the rest of the loadout is time to do other stuff. So this is a very good place to make use of mechanics that take a bit more time to use. In other words, the multiplier, if you will, that this Volt build gives to the rest of the loadout is time to execute a more complicated mechanic. Enter the Wizard Pistol. This small, disappearing boy is going to generate a ton of energy for discharges. It's all about energizing shot. When you deploy Dispensary, just move out of your vacuum range and shoot the energy orbs instead for twice as much energy. This can also still activate Arcane Energize. Another powerful benefit of doing this is that Energy Pulse from Zeneric's passive tree, this will generate extra energy based on the increased amount you got. So normally an energy orb would give you 25 energy and you'd get 12.5 energy over 5 seconds. Now you're going to get 50 energy from an energy orb, a little more, it's 110%, but you get it. And you're going to get 25 energy over 5 seconds, so that's pretty nice. Since this playstyle is going to be staying in one general area a lot, it's not too difficult to just simply hang out with proper social distancing from your dispensary and snap up energy orbs as they spawn. With that Zeneric energy passive interaction, you're going to get a full 75 energy, a little bit more actually, from each energy orb, which is enough to cast Discharge every single time one spawns. Remember though that Dispensary won't give you more orbs until you use what it's already there, so if you aren't going to shoot them, you should move closer so you can vacuum them up. And now energizing shot, that could be a lot of secondaries. This is also a kit gun for Pax Bolt, another source of energy, efficiency, and also some more strength, bringing my loadout back to above 100% strength overall if I have this and energy conversion when I cast Discharge. Pax Bolt can be really bad if you're trying to maintain a bunch of powers, but this build is doing the opposite of that. The only thing you'd cast frequently is Electric Shield, and that isn't affected by strength anyway. All you have to do is kill an enemy with a headshot before your discharges, and you'll get a bunch of bonus stats. I enjoy Secondary Gaze for this use case. I like that it's precise, it feels good to pick up energy orbs with it. And as with kit guns in general, exactly what parts you should use will depend on your personal taste. The basic thing you definitely want is a loader with full critical chance, so that's kill stream or splat. Beam weapons put out so much status already. Then I chose Haymaker. I like how Gaze just loses range instead of fire rate with the higher damage grips, and I wanted to maximize damage, but that does mean that I have to stand a somewhat specific distance away from Dispensary. You saw that with that waypoint before. Outside of vacuum range and inside of Haymaker Gaze range. So that's like between 10 and 20 meters away, or it would be between 10 and 22 meters, but I'm using a Beast Companion and Fetch has a slightly larger range than Vacuum, so I need to be between 13.5 and 22 Gaze Haymaker's range away from energy orbs to shoot them. Now, as I said, I don't think that's a big deal because you're already hanging around the area anyway. It's easy enough to just be at the right distance. If you don't want to have to worry about that as much, I'd consider Ruinous Extension, but I use Ice Storm in that slot because Secondary Gaze has terrible magazine capacity, even with the second largest magazine. Not the largest one because that can't maximize critical chance. Anyway, you get it. You could sacrifice damage for beam range in a few different ways, and I chose not to. That takes care of the energy. I want to talk about the Necramech thing. No, not you, Arkwing. The Void Rig Necramech. So you saw in the intro, but the tech here is that you can use a dispensary as a power source for the Void Rig Necramech's Exalted Turret mode. That lets you shoot the turret for much longer without leaving it. Necramechs don't have vacuums at the time of this recording. This ability has a large initial cost, and there aren't that many ways to reduce it. So unless you gain energy while you are using it, you can't use it for very long, and it's very powerful, so you might wish to use it for a long time. And Volt is especially qualified for Void Rigging because of Electric Shield, which will defend the Necramech while it's stationary and boost its damage, now that that's necessary. Necramech builds are not much to write home about. You can essentially just equip everything, and I basically just did that. I equipped every mod that affects the turret, and that's it. Don't worry about that build too much. The Arcabex does such a preposterous amount of damage, it'll be fine either way. Likewise, the weapon build for the Arcabex is probably the least important weapon build you'll ever see. It just does so much damage that you can use basically anything, even remotely sensible, and everything will die. Yes, you're reading that correctly. That's 187,000 damage from the explosions from this weapon. Yeah, that's enough most of the time, shock and surprise. It's generally true that you could just use something sensible and the weapon will do alright, but it's even more true here that it just does not matter what you pick. Oh, actually, one tiny exception. There is that little set of arc gun heavy weapon mods that give you stuff when you aim. You can't aim with the Arcabex, so don't use those. I'm not sure how often I'm going to use this heavy weapon on this loadout, or the Necramech's weapon for that matter, but one thing I wasn't planning to include in this loadout is an explosive weapon, so let's do that. The Kuva Ayanga, sure, this is a good weapon. Nothing to say here really, just a solid piece of hardware. When building heavy weapons in general, strongly consider using critical focus to fill out your build. Heavy weapons are a bit different in that they tend to want an extra crit mod instead of an extra multi-shot mod, because that's what they have. They don't have a second multi-shot mod, and they do have a third critical mod. For the Necramech's weapon, you'll find anything accurate at long range to be useful. Close range enemies will not be a thing because of the Arcabex, so anything that can hit a target accurately, especially at long range, I think that's fine. It doesn't really matter how much damage it does. If you want damage when you're using a Necramech, you're gonna use the Arcabex. Okay, so back to Discharge and the Companion. To increase discharge damage further against tankier enemies, I'm using the Panzer Vulpaphyla. Viral Quills is basically sarin spores, but viral. Very powerful, basically automatic. They spread through the map and give everything a lot of stacks of viral, enough said. And as usual, Vulpaphylas are very low maintenance thanks to their devolution mechanic. They become invulnerable sentinels when they die, so they're basically immortal. Dying just means you get some downtime on viral quills, because the viral attack they have in sentinel form doesn't inflict spores. This build's job is to keep the Panzer alive, so special attack precepts like Sharpened Claws and Pounce are here, because they keep the Vulpaphyla safer than normal attacks do. Tech Assault is a thing that exists that keeps it alive more. I'm not sure if Swipe props spores more, but why not? That also makes Hunter Recovery better, but this particular loadout doesn't benefit much from that. Link Health is more of a standard choice. It's not especially good on this loadout, but I do want more health on here, even if it isn't a lot. One thing you can do to keep your Predicites and Vulpaphylas alive longer is to give them alloy armor using the appropriate mutagen. Alloy armor just has the best type matchups against most damage from enemies. Keep in mind that Capacitance also gives overshields to your companions. But of course, one of a Vulpaphyla's greatest strengths is simply being a source of animal instinct and vacuum that can't permanently die, and animal instinct, the enemy radar in particular, is really useful here for discharge targeting using the minimap, since it goes through walls. For melee, I think a backup source of energy is nice, since this build does a whole lot of nothing if you don't have any energy. This Daggerzaw is great for killing enemies, and for restoring energy with Exodia Brave, one of the most powerful energy restoring options you have. Dagger heavy attacks hit twice and force slash and impact on every hit, so Condition Overload is powerful on this particular heavy attack build, usually not the greatest option for a heavy attack build because you only hit once or twice, but this one you will get statuses quite readily even with no status chance. And this is also a dagger, so you can use Covert Lethality with Corrupt Charge to stay at 3x combo for every heavy attack. The Zaw parts are very simple, it's just high attack speed and maximum critical chance. Attack speed affects the heavy attack swing speed alongside the wind-up stat, and crit is the default thing to go for since these heavy attacks force status effects already. This weapon is going to kill enemies by doing a slash proc. It gets that automatically, so you don't need status chance to proc it, and then you want it to crit. Lastly, your primary weapon should shore up any weaknesses in your loadout. For me right now, I don't have many weapons that are very good unless enemies are really close by, so I'm going to bring Super Vandal, just a general purpose assault rifle. One little bonus with Super Vandal is that I can take it out and just hold it while Discharge is killing everything to get some free energy here and there with its Syndicate augment. I'll start off by showing you some defense missions in the Steel Path, one place where Capacitance Volt can be pretty great. You can restore shields to defense objectives in defense missions and mobile defenses and etc. And since enemies are stunned in the process, this can be a particularly good way to turn one of these missions around. The thing about the Steel Path is it showcases how Discharge Volt is not going to be able to kill these enemies if they have armor no matter what. So having the duration lets you just stun them for the entire mission, and you don't have to kill them theoretically. You can also very, very easily take your time with Pax Bolt, because they're stunned with the electricity effect. You can really easily hit their heads. Basically, any mission where you defend a target that can have its shields restored is a good mission for this loadout. Maybe less good for interception. You can still cover a lot of the map, though. Obviously, capture missions or some types of sabotage are a bad fit as you have to keep moving. I think Exterminate isn't so bad if you can get enough energy. Zenric Energizing Dash and the Zaw Dagger become more useful than Dispensary in that case. Hijack would be a weirdly good fit. Not that many hijack missions, but if you go for duration like I did, you can use Discharge to get enemies to leave the payload alone, and they'll simultaneously give you the shields you need to move it for a fairly long time. And I personally enjoy this loadout in survival kind of a lot. I'm not sure entirely why. More duration is really helpful there again. You won't usually hit a ton of enemies at once with Discharge in a survival. It's just not a mode where you can simply wipe the whole map, but the enemies you do hit will battery power your shields while you go brawl with some more enemies as they spawn in. And then because you'll be brawling with some more enemies, you can use the dagger for more energy regen. Overall, I'd go for the duration if you care about using this loadout in other places, and even if you don't, I do feel it's very similar to the more even mix of strength, range, and duration you might otherwise use, but that's good too. The main place that it kind of matters more which one you go for is Elite Sanctuary Onslaught, but I want to talk about that a lot. This is a pretty niche situation, but if you want to use Discharge here, which I don't necessarily think it's that amazing, but it is good in this situation, I want to talk about this. So it has trouble with both Infested and Grineer waves. For Infested, it's the energy drain. You can't keep the energy to cast it easily. And for Grineer, it's the armor. You could spend resources in your loadout to try to do more damage through Grineer armor. I tried that. I tried things like Fire Blast and Breach Surge with Discharge. They do a lot more damage to enemies that have armor, but they're still not definitively killing higher level armored enemies all of the time. Line of sight is often an issue since not everything goes through walls like Discharge. Now, if you can't kill Grineer with Discharge alone, it still does something. You still stun them, you still get overshields, but if you don't do something about the infested waves that drain your energy, you can't do anything. The entire build does nothing. So that's why I went more in that direction. You might be thinking the loadout has a lot of different ways to get energy back, maybe like more than is necessary. That's why, one of the reasons why I went more in that direction. You have the space, and it allows you to get through those waves. It makes a big difference in that situation. The large doses of energy from Dispensary and Energizing Shot are a pretty effective way to cast stuff during the energy drain. And again, ESO is a place where killing enemies really fast does technically matter at higher levels, so duration isn't quite as good there on paper, but you can't spam abilities, like you can't recast Discharge over and over again, so having it have a longer duration, it doesn't really matter because you can't cast it until close to the end of the duration anyway, or you'll get it turned off by Samaris. You really don't gain anything by doing ESO past Zone 8 either, so I thought it would be a bit of a waste to optimize this build for that one thing too much. It's good for lots of other stuff, and I feel like I got a good balance of something that will solve problems in ESO, but also be good for many other kinds of missions. Yeah, the Necramech thing, that's also a thing you can do with this loadout. It might seem a little pasted on, but there is a lot of defense in open world missions, for example. It's so satisfying to be able to just use the turret mode for a longer time. Here I'm seeing how long I can stay in turret mode with just like a whatever amount of starting energy and dispensary. I'll speed it up for you. That was 1.5 minutes necessary. The defense from Electric Shield helps you not die while shaking those turret guns around. You know what else is shaking around in this loadout? This fashion frame. This Volt fashion is all about, look at the fingies. Look at how Limbo Agile does this thing with the fingies. Look at the fingies. Look at this chest plate that I put on that looks like fingies. Look at the fingy. Bit of jank on the shoulders here. So you can see if you look closely that wine color that I'm using for the tertiary, that is a metallic there. The other parts match, and so it's not really a huge deal. There are a few other places where it technically doesn't match. You can see here, that's not metallic, whoopsie. I think on this loadout, because it's meant to be a bit of a silly appearance, I don't mind as much. Also, I like how these shoulders look on Volt a lot. I think they give a different identity from the default Volt shoulder pads. I like these emissive dots. For some reason, they just make me think Volt energy for some reason. There are a lot of little dots around the fashion that, anyway, I don't know, it feels like a good fit to me. The Grax helmet, when I look at these hair curler things, the other thing I always think of is battery Volt. So I liked this helmet, even though it's a little silly. I think these little fang spark plug things are really silly as well. I do like the Grax skins overall. This helmet is a little silly, but it always reminds me of Battery Volt and Lithium Ion Battery Volt, which are two popular Volt loadouts that I've made in the past that inspired both of the Volt frameworks, so I really wanted to honor it somehow. And then this Cyandana. This thing is the savior of my existence from Volt's weird butt reactor thing. Like, what even is this? Also, Volt's default skin, even the Grax skin, the colors, there's just such huge swaths of these color channels. I do think the Grax skin does a much better job breaking it up, but even still, this sort of kilt thing, like there's a lot of that color and breaking it up is not easy. I think this is a good job kind of matching the aesthetic of whatever this butt reactor thing is, and then it also, it doesn't clip, you know, it doesn't have any weird, the posture also makes that look better. When you're standing up, it looks good, but a lot of Cyandanas, if you had this pose, Limbo Agile, they wouldn't clip, but then when you ran, they would. So I don't know. Personally, I think this is the way to go. Speaking of the lots of color blobs on this fashion, you know, these colors are like, look at this. This is like the entire fashion. These bands on Volt's legs, these are not recolorable. They can only be that color. This color looks like that's what it is, but it's not. These cannot be recolored. That was the fashion. I hope you've enjoyed Necramech Capacitance Volt. I'll see you on the other side.